As you probably noticed in the readings, there's this subtle theme of blindness and sight. In the Job reading, Job says, I'd heard about you, but now I see you, right? And you see how Linda's been bringing that out in children's time, in the prayers, and her planning of the service today. So I want us to think about blindness, but it's not about blindness as a kind of physical malady. The purpose of a story like this story about Bartimaeus and Jesus healing him is not simply to say, look at Jesus, he must be the Son of God because he can do this kind of thing. There's a lot more subtlety and meaning in the story than just Jesus can do incredible things. He must be divine. He must be the Son of God. Because when we read these stories, we're supposed to see ourselves in them, and Linda's been bringing that out. We are to see ourselves as lacking sight. What does it mean for us to be blind? It doesn't have to do with my poor eyesight and my having worn glasses since I was in third grade. It's got nothing to do with that, right? But it has to do with who I am and how I live and what I perceive and my spiritual disposition, my perception. And so these stories are more about really getting us to look within ourselves, to see ourselves in the story as the person needing this help. We've been following the lectionary, and it's been taking us through Mark this summer. And in just the previous couple of chapters, we've seen a lot of blindness. The disciples arguing about who's the greatest, and Jesus saying, guys, it's not about who's the greatest. It's not about competition for position. We've seen the disciples naming Jesus correctly, but misunderstanding entirely who Jesus is. We've seen the disciples push back against the cross because they don't understand the cross as the outpouring and statement of God's incredible, unconditional, long-suffering love for the whole world. No, they see it as failure, and so they want to reject it. See, all these stories are blindness. And so it's kind of interesting to me that we get to the end of this chapter, and now we have a story about a man who's blind, but in a lot of ways, all the previous stories have been about blindness. The disciples looking for power and not how to serve. Jesus saying, but I came to serve. So here we are with the story of Bartimaeus, and it's got some ironies in it that I want us to notice before we look at kind of the spiritual meaning of blindness in general. So we ask ourselves, who's really blind? Bartimaeus, though blind, is one who can perceive that Jesus is willing to be merciful. I don't know if anyone else perceives that. He does. The fact that the others are discouraging him from calling out to Jesus and calling out specifically, have mercy on me. The fact that they're discouraging him, sternly telling him, be quiet. It's like they have no idea that Jesus is about showing mercy. So they seem to be blind, though they can see, to the reality that mercy is what Jesus has come to show. Well, they're probably thinking, they're leaving Jericho. They're on their way to Jerusalem. They're thinking, this is going to be it. He's going to set up the kingdom in Jerusalem. It's about power. That's why they've been arguing about who's greatest. That's why a little bit later, we saw a couple of weeks ago, the disciple James and John say, can we sit on your right and left? They're thinking that. But Bartimaeus understands, no, Jesus has come to show mercy, compassion, kindness, grace, forgiveness, love. Those are all the things that Jesus is really about. And Bartimaeus gets it, right? So he calls out, have mercy on me. He can see what the others can't. And then there's a bit of irony that those who were sternly telling Bartimaeus to be quiet, when Jesus calls him, they say in verse 49, take courage. I'm like, you've been discouraging this guy the whole time, and now you're like, oh, take courage. Like, He had courage already. He had courage to call out and to keep on calling out when everyone else was trying to get him to be quiet. And you're telling him, take courage? He's demonstrating courage. He already has that courage. It's ironic. But now they want to encourage him. I don't think I would be very encouraged by those who were discouraging me. I would just see, a bit of hypocrisy perhaps. And then the third irony I see is at the end when Jesus says, your faith has made you well. Because you could read that and think, oh, so God had nothing to do with it. He healed himself by his own belief, which of course would be an utterly false assumption to derive. That would be not the right conclusion. He's calling out to Jesus to heal him. He's asking Jesus to heal him. And Jesus says, somewhat ironically, your faith, your trust has been fundamental to your own healing. I don't think it's, as it were, excluding the work of God or the mercy of Jesus in this moment, but it is showing him he has had his own role in what has happened. His kind of selfless trust. I like the link here in this passage between courage and faith. And I think there is a strong link between being courageous and being faithful. Often trusting in the face of perhaps discouraging circumstances or discouraging people. And so the statement that your faith, your trust, your risk, your willingness to stand against the crowd, as it were, to continue to call out, to do this anyway, that's bringing about healing. And so I think there's a message there. Yes, lots of times we have to stand against kind of the prevailing tide that we find in the world, in life, maybe even in our own lives. Sometimes we have to stand against the prevailing thought processes of our own minds, which can be discouraging. So there's an encouraging part to Jesus saying, your willingness to risk and trust has made you well. So I see those ironies in the story about this man blind and healed. But I want us to think a little bit more, as Linda was suggesting in the prayers and things she prepared for the service, is that blindness symbolizes something spiritually. And as Linda was saying, it's important that we all recognize that we are blind. There's a passage that I think gets at this. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 9. If you remember, in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, it's the long story about the man born blind that Jesus heals, and then Jesus is instantly just away in the crowd. The man doesn't know who healed him. The religious leaders start to grill him. Who healed you? Well, I don't know, And he gets into it with them because they want to criticize this rogue healer who's out there, not a part of the institutional church of their day. And the man who's healed says, well, I don't know, but he's healed me. All I've got is my own experience of what he's done. So the whole chapter is this back and forth. And at the very end, Jesus talks to these religious leaders, and here's what he says, and I think this gets to the idea of what the spiritual meaning, the metaphorical meaning of blindness is. Jesus says, I'm reading John 9, 40 and 41. Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, that is to Jesus, we are not blind too, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, we see, your sin remains. Now that last statement of Jesus is enigmatic, isn't it? What does he mean? And because he mentions the word sin, we might think, oh, he's talking about forgiveness. If you were blind, you would be forgiven. But because you say we see, you're not forgiven. But this isn't about forgiveness. Here's why. There's a couple different Greek words that we translate into English sin. One of them is the word that sometimes we translate, and it has to do with sin, we translate it as trespass or transgress. That idea is, here's the line, and when you trespass, you go where you're not supposed to go, right? No trespassing. We see those signs. Don't walk across the property line. Someone has posted, they don't want you there. Don't trespass. That word means, here's what I ought to do and I don't do it, or here's what I should not do and I cross that line. Trespass, transgress. But there's another Greek word, harmatia, which is the word Paul uses when he says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Because literally that word means to fall short of the mark. It's the idea of like you're firing an arrow at a target, but you fail to reach it. The arrow falls short. You miss the target. Not miss it long, you miss it short. That's the word Jesus is using. So he's really not talking about forgiveness. What he's saying, if I were doing my translation, I keep telling you how I would translate this if I were doing it. I would translate it this way. Jesus said to them, go your faith, in the wrong passage. He would say here in John 9, Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not be falling short. But since you say, we see, you continue to fall short. He's not talking about sin and whether they can be forgiven. He's talking about you keep messing up because you think you can see clearly. But if you would acknowledge, you know what, I can't see clearly, you would stop messing up, falling short. And that's the idea, spiritually, metaphorically, of blindness. It's what Linda was talking about. I need someone to help me. And we all do. Not only could we speak of Jesus in those terms, we talk about having blind spots, and some people, will say, well, I've learned to see what's in my blind spot. No, we don't do that, right? You can see what's in my blind spot. I can never see it because it's a blind spot, right? By definition, I can't see it. And the only way I come to know what's in my blind spot is you tell me, and I trust you. You tell me, you say, Greg, you keep coming across in this way, and I know you don't mean to, but you don't realize it, but you keep coming across this way when you say these things. And I'm thinking, no, I don't. And if I know that you're truthful and that you really care about me and you're not trying to, criticize me, I might start thinking, you know what, maybe I am. I can't see it. It's my blind spot. See, Jesus is talking to us, was talking to those leaders in that same sort of way. There's things you can't see, and as long as you refuse to acknowledge that there is anything you can't see, you can see it all, you will continue to make the same mistakes over and over. But if you will humble yourself and say, maybe there's things I don't understand, I can't see, and I need someone else to guide me, then you will stop making the same mistakes, right? That's what Jesus is talking about. And I think that's somewhat of even the meaning here with the story of Bartimaeus. Who's blind? The answer should be, we all are, about various things. And we all need guidance, help, someone to assist us to see more clearly. That's where we come back to seeing faith as related to courage. I've spoken in the recent year about Paul Tillich. He has a book, The Courage to Be, which is his book on faith. he decided to call faith the courage to be. And he links it to this idea of courage. And I think it takes that kind of courage. It takes a kind of faith for us to be willing to accept the reality that there's things we don't see, ways that we continue to mess things up about our lives, our relationships, and be humble enough. And it takes courage to be humble enough to say, I need you to help me be a better person. Say that to one another. To listen to one another. To say that in prayer. God, show me what it is I need to see. And then realize he may do that through the mouth of your friends who help you see where you're stumbling. So our faith will make us well. Our courage to look at our own blindness. There's healing when we have the courage to look at what's hidden to us and ask the question, Lord, what is it? Please show us. May God help us in this endeavor through his holy name. Amen.